Hello, YouTubers. This is another session for me and Mehdi to continue our discussion and our pair programming session, building processing service in a simple application that is building to track cases of the coronavirus. And as usual, I'm joined here by my dear friend Mehdi. How are you,
Hello
Mehdi?
everyone, I am
Good. It's
fine.
been a while.
Yeah,
Doing
I have,
your exams, doing your
yes,
college
it's
exams.
time to it's time to pay them off.
Time to play them off. Almost done. Your masters. Maddie, my friend, is doing master's degree, and he's a very successful guy. He wants to, kind of get the degree, build a good career, and I'm really happy that I've met you so early, in your career, to kind of just give you just share with you lessons I've learned, when I was at this stage in my life.
Okay, let's back to work and I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Uh, in the every project we validate, for example, we already validate the ID in the
Uh-huh.
in the foundation.
Uh-huh.
And then we will validate ID again in the UI app. And
Uh-huh.
now we are validating in the processing too. What's
That's
the
right.
point? What is the point?
That seems a little redundant, right? Like, why are
Yes.
we validating? So just for the people that are not familiar with the pattern, what Matt is asking is actually a very, very legitimate question. People come to me all the time and they say, Hassan, it seems like you have some form or another of redundant validations that are happening. What does that mean? Assume that you have a storage broker in here. So let's say student storage broker, right? And this guy interfaces with the database. So here's some database and it's talking to the database. We want to make sure before the data enters the database, right? We want to make sure that every single bit of that data is in good stance. It follows particular structural and logical and integration validations, right? So what we do is, and that's one of the main responsibilities of a foundation service, is that we build this foundation service. It's called student service, right? And what this student service does is that when you have a student object, let's just assume that this little circle here is a student object. So this here is a student, right? And this student object is trying to be inserted into the database. So ideally, in a very simple scenario, you're putting a controller in here, which is an API endpoint, and you go and say, this is my student's controller, right? And then the API request comes in. Let me bring that guy up front. The API request comes in, it gets validated in here, structurally and logically and externally, and then it gets passed to the storage broker to be finally persisted in the database, right?
Right.
So far, so good. There's no problem there, right? I'm getting data in and I'm validating the data and making sure the data, massaging the data, making sure it's in good stance before I persist that data in the database. That's okay, right? What Maddie is asking about, though, you guys, which is a great point, is that when we build in a another service that does a higher order business logic, right? So let's zoom out a little bit and let's say we added in here a new service that does orchestrations on the primitive type, right? So it uses a select all and an insert, sorry, a retrieval and an add and then a modify all together, like we showed you in previous sessions for the standard compliant services. We want to do an upsert functionality, right? So let's say you have student processing service. And this student processing service here, this is where things get a little interesting, right? Because Mahdi says, Hassan, I know that you said that we want to be able to validate a student in here, and we talked about validating only what you need. So we're not validating everything. We're just validating them. This object is not null, and we're validating that this object ID is valid, right? So Mahdi's question here is, this service is already doing that for me. Why do I have to do it again? Like this foundation service is already doing validate students not null and validate the student ID. Why do I have to validate this here again? Right?
Right.
And there's two answers to that. There's two different answers to that. The first answer is that, a student any service that's higher than the foundation level services It has to ensure that the data it's using is in good state before it starts using that data. Because if you don't validate that the student is not null, your entire process is going to blow up when you try to extract an ID out of that process, right? So that's number one thing. Number two thing, you're also using the ID itself to go search and navigate through things, right?
Right.
The third thing that we really need to pay attention to is that we don't we really decouple responsibilities and we decouple concerns and we also decouple other services work. Like if the student service in here is doing work, this service here is not going to rely on that in any way, shape, or form, right?
Uh-huh.
It'll say, I don't know what's downstream and I don't know what downstream services are doing. I will just do my due diligence to make sure my data is in a good state before I let it downstream to any other service. So your processing service here says my concern is that I have a student in a good shape that is not null and that my ID is valid. Student name, student number, any of that, date outside of my concern. I don't use that data. Therefore, I'm going to let it downstream because I don't do anything with that data, right? So this
Right.
is why foundation services sometimes are some of the like they take a lot of work to be put together. Their foundation, when you're building a foundation of a house, it has to be really solid, right? Because these foundation services are the last point of contact before you start entering the external realm, the integration realm. Does that make
Uh-huh.
sense? What
Yes.
do you think about that idea? Do you think that's okay?
Now it's making more sense.
Yes.
Mm,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
it's
so
like
mhm.
it's like insurance.
Yeah, you don't know what your downstream service is going to be doing, right? And you shouldn't rely on that. You shouldn't rely on your downstream service doing any work for you. Like you can't go and say, well, the downstream service is going to take care of that. Why is that? Why is that really important, Mahdi? Because I'll tell you why is that important. When your service gets a little bit bigger, let's put that in an enterprise level. Let's say your controller is all the way down here and you actually have a bunch of coordination services and orchestration. So let's bring a real world, real life example here. So here's a couple of those, and then there's a couple of others in here. Here's another one and another one. So these two are two processing services for different entities. And then you have this orchestration service sitting here and an orchestration service sitting here. And each one of them is doing its own orchestration for their entity. So that's I have two orchestration services at this level, right? And
Right.
then not just there, you have on top of that setting a coordination service that's orchestrating the orchestration. So orchestrating orchestration, that's what we call coordination, right? Okay, so now you have student orchestration service in here, and you have some other student coordination service up here before you actually reach the controller. Now here where it gets crazy, maybe this guy validates what it cares about. If it doesn't do that, it might pass bad data downstream before you actually reach that level, and it might screw things up here. Why is that important? Because this guy might be already making calls to the database. Like this orchestration level might have already did a successful call up here in the database, but because the data is corrupt and the coordination service didn't take care of it up ahead, the data gets created in one place and it doesn't get created in another. And we will also talk a little bit more about, reverts and commit revert and all that. There's a lot of um, fail-safe mechanisms that we can take care of to basically handle situations like these. Does that make sense? So you're so
No.
you're, so you're validating for services downstream, and you're also validating for services upstream. So every point of contact here. One sec. All right. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
Sorry about that. I have a crazy cat. So okay, so this is the deal, right? So yeah, so you want to make sure that your services, are doing the right thing to take care of being able to handle the validations at every stage. That's really, really important. Okay. So to visualize things to people before we jump in, if we go back to Visual Studio and just show people what we've been working on, our processing service in here. So this is my upsert country async. This is already doing validation, like the country is not supposed to be null. But if you look at either one of these foundation services, it's also validating if the country is not supposed to be null, right?
Yes.
Each
Okay.
one of them is doing for itself because it doesn't know what the downstream service is doing, and you shouldn't rely on services downstream to do that work for you. Does that make sense? Okay, and this guy is over what, 120 for sure. Yikes. Okay, so you got to be careful with that stuff, Mehdi. Okay, so okay, I have this guy here. I have this guy here. Here you go. Okay, all right, let's go back to this guy. So you are giving me a failing test in here. The
Yeah.
last time we talked, we said let's validate the IDs and all that. So you're going and saying, hey, the ID is required for the country and all that. So I'm just going to go up here and go here, and you're already saying validate country. And I'm just going to add a new rule in here. So this guy is going to be extract this guy here. Nope, something like this. Extract method, and I'm just going to say validate country is not null, like this. Okay, so that's one part. Now let's go build a tiny business rules engine here. So let's go and say private void, private static void validate, and this guy takes params, right? And then it takes a dynamic rule and maybe a parameter, and this is the list of validations as input parameters. Okay, so that's a tuple. And then in here, I'm gonna say var, this is a processing service, right? So invalid, right, country, invalid country,
Processing.
processing exception, right? So this is new, invalid country processing exception, done and done. And then I'm going to go here and say for each validation and validations, which is really, I'm going to deconstruct it. That's a deconstruction practice. So a dynamic rule and a string parameter, right? Okay, so if that's the case, then we're going to go and say if rule.condition is satisfied, let's go ahead and use this invalid country processing service upsert data list where the key, right, is the parameter and the value is the rule.message. So we're collecting a report for all the issues that are happening in a particular system. The last thing I want to do here is that go and say invalid country exception throw if contains error. So this is my tiny business rules engine. Just less than 10 lines of code. You build an entire rules engine that can take rules and process it and create a report. What's the other thing that we want to build? I want to create a rule, right? So this is static dynamic is invalid. That takes in a GUID, an ID, right? And returns an anonymous object that says my condition here is if this ID is GUID.empty. Wow, we don't have anything in here. We need to get some references, right? So this is GUID.empty. So that's one part. And then the message here is I'm assuming ID is required, right, Matty? That's the
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now the last thing here is just to call that guy. So I'm gonna go here and say validate, right? And I'm gonna go and say rule is invalid. I'm passing in country.id, right? And then in the next one here, I'm gonna go and say parameter, right? So parameter and then country.id, just like this. I prefer, we should probably do name of, right? Country.id. Okay. Let me ask you this question, just out of curiosity. Why don't we Um, let's see here if you're with me. Why don't we include this validate country is not null as part of this business rules engine? Why don't we do that?
Because simply is a different level, different thing.
What would happen? Well,
Because
why different thing? I mean, if you go into your foundation services down here, let's go to the foundation services. These are the first services that you built. You went up here and you built all of these things, right? These are
right,
all different rules. So what makes this different? Why don't we add that null condition as part of these rules? Like we go here and say rule is null like this, and then go and say country, huh? And
because
then go,
knifing null is about the existence.
okay,
For example, if there is nothing, that means what you want to validate.
right. So what you're trying to say is something that I call in the standard a circuit breaking validation. What does that mean? You can't continue from that point onwards because every single validation rule that you're going to run after that heavily depends on this particular, we call it a deal breaker.
Yeah.
Deal
There
breaker
should
circuit.
be something to validate or do
Yeah,
something.
you have to make sure that there's foundational validations, circuit breaking, and then there are ones that are not circuit breaking where you're just collecting a report. The older versions of the standard 1.0, we used to go and say everything is circuit breaking, but that's very, very wrong and it wasn't convenient. But we continue to evolve and grow. The standard is not a holy book, it's not set in stone, and people shouldn't assume that it is. Okay, so let's sit this and let's run this. Let's run these tests and see what happens.
I think you have to go to our method and
Mm.
in the processing service.
And I also didn't. I didn't also. I also didn't do the exception handling.
Yeah,
Okay, let's do this. So I'm gonna go here and try to let's first find the country. So this is validate country, but this validate country here, let's do a control K E. Yikes, control KD. Oh, what happened here? Let's do this. There you go. That's much better. Control KD. Yeah, there you go. And then this try catch here. Okay, let's take and handle that exception. This is what we really want to do, right? Invalid
country.
country processing exception, right? And then in here we're gonna do what? Do we need to localize that exception? What do you think? Throw, create, and log validation exception. What do you think? Should I localize that guy?
No,
Why?
because we are not doing any kind of business with the external resource. For example, we are not communicating with the database here or any service which may fail or may which they throw the exception. For example,
Hmm.
there is no SQL exception, there is no duplicate key or
Yeah,
nothing.
so it's so the exception here itself is already localized.
Yes.
An already localized exception doesn't need to be localized again, right? So let's
Yeah.
go here and run this real quick and see if that guy pass. There is a pass, right? So now we come to the interesting parts. This guy's a pass. There you go. Now we come to the interesting part. We want to be able to handle exceptions, right? We want to be able to go and say, how does a processing service, handles exceptions? This is the topic of this video. I'm sorry, we're 18 minutes in, but it's really important to set up these foundations and be aware of the work that is being done. There is an ongoing process. First of all, in the .NET world in general, there are all kinds of different thoughts about exception handling. It goes from people who, will say don't handle exceptions at all until at the top layer, and at the top layer they say try catch exception and then just throw the exception or
Throw the
turn
message.
throw a message, right? Or even worse, they'll go and say, any exception that happens in the system, whether it's validation or not, return 500, right? Don't do that. That's really bad. Don't do that, right? There's other kinds of people that will go and say, well, we want to stay at the top level. I don't want to handle every exception, right? We want to stay at the top level. And at that top level, I want to be able to come and say, let me find out all the possible exceptions that can be thrown, right? And then let's handle all of them at the controller level. That's also inconvenient, especially if your system is doing something complex. You're going to end up with 30, 40 exceptions, in the controller, and then your controller becomes unreadable. Our school of thought is a little bit different than that. So let me show you here what we do and how we're going to do that. We do something called wrapping and unwrapping, right? We talked about categorization, localization before,
Yeah.
where we go and say, if you have, let's start simple. Let's say you have a broker and a service and a controller. This is our tri nature of everything, and your broker, is communicating with your service, and your service, this is your foundation service, and your service is communicating with a controller. Okay. The broker say through an error, some exception, let's assume that this is an exception in here, right? And this guy, let's say this is a SQL exception, right? This guy is rightfully so an error that we take and wrap, localize and wrap. So we localize it into failed dependency, right? Exception. And then we wrap that guy up, we categorize it into something that we call dependency exception, right? So this is failed storage exception, failed storage exception, and this is dependency exception. So this guy lives right inside of this guy. Send that guy to the front. Here's my guy here, and this guy is the big guy that we, basically consider a category,
Right.
right? And then as soon as we reach up, this exception goes all the way up here. This guy picks up that exception and turns it into an HTTP code, right? So it takes
Right.
that exception up here and it turns it into a 500 error. Let's take that guy out, put that guy here. This guy becomes a 500 error or internal server error, basically. Rightfully so, because it's internal server error. So this is internal server error 500, because that's the language that these controllers speak, right? But what if you have a processing service ahead of that? Especially when the exception that is being thrown is nothing that is, just the usual exception that anybody could handle. What if the exception that came out is duplicate key exception? So you're getting a duplicate key exception, and then your service is picking that up and saying this is a dependency validation exception, and it's localizing it as already
Thank you.
exists exception. The item already exists, right? Now here's the problem. This already exists exception can return conflict 409, which is an HTTP code that basically tells the person that's, basically it's telling the person that is communicating with it, this item that you're trying to insert is already there. Why are you trying to insert the item again, right? The problem here comes where, you're already categorized, but in here you can go and say, well, what if I have higher order business logic required to live at this level? And this higher order business logic is communicating with my foundation service. So this here is a processing service. And this guy now is receiving this dependency validation exception. What do? We do something called the unwrapping and wrapping. Unwrap and wrap. What does that mean? We push that forward, it takes that exception in here and it keeps that inner one, and then
Uh-huh.
it creates its own category, and it calls it what? It calls it processing dependency validation exception. It puts its own signature on it. Why is that? Because that helps this processing service collect a bunch of validation errors that may happen downstream, right? So remember, there's categorization that collects a whole bunch of things under one category, so the controllers or any upstream consumer knows how to deal with that exception and handle it properly. Exceptions, unfortunately, are some of the most overlooked pieces in the .NET world, specifically when it comes to building software, right? When we're building software, you'll see a lot of people go and say, nope, I don't need to do any of that. That's a lot of work. Why would I do any of that? Let let the original exception, whatever that exception, this is how you'll see a lot of software. This is the original exception in here. Here's a exception in here. They let it propagate all the way up here and then throw it as 500. See the problem there? So with the standard, no, we actually treat exceptions, with an industrial mindset. No, this exception, because let me just, and for the people watching us, these exceptions, when you're building some kind of, rinky-dink kind of app, you're doing a mom and pop shop, and maybe the storage is broken, and hey, John, they call you on the phone, or they yell at you from upstairs and you come down to fix their app, sure. But if you're building something serious, your code can land a spaceship on Mars. Your code could be used in a hospital where people's lives are on the line. And if you're not very specific about the kind of exceptions and the errors that your system is producing, You could be your code could literally be the reason someone doesn't get the right attention they need at the time they need. I'll give you an example. Let's say we're doing validation exceptions. Let me show you like a real world example. You're doing validation exceptions and you're saying if this turbo machinery reaches a temperature of 180 degrees, throw an exception immediately so whatever is consuming that executes a command to stop the turbo machine. Like we need a big fat error on the screen that says overheating, overheating, overheating. That's a validation exception, right? It's a logical validation exception. The data is fine, but logically that data is unacceptable, right? So this is where, I worked in a company in the past, I think some 7 or 8 years ago. If you don't throw that error on time and be very specific, you could kill someone. You could cause someone to continue to use the machine until it just blows up. Do you understand? So take exceptions very seriously. A lot of people say, well, when I start building a serious project, I'll take care of it. If you don't do it with the calculator, you're not going to be doing it with the spaceship because it's a habit. You're building a habit, right? Software engineering is a habit. Take the smallest app that you build very, very seriously. So when you're building the big app, the spaceship or the hospital app, you will be able to do that as a second nature. Okay, now I talked a lot. Talk is cheap. Show me the code, right? That's what Linus Torvalds says. Talk is cheap. Show me
right?
the code. Okay, so here's what we're going to do today, my friend. There are two kinds of exceptions that we want to handle that come from downstream service, which is your country service, and we want to handle those. Your downstream service throws four kinds of exceptions: validation exceptions, dependency validation exception, dependency exception, and service exception. Yes? We
Yes.
want to handle those individually, right? We want to couple those together in terms of how we're going to behave towards them. So here's my processing service. I'm going to create something here called theory. And theory data, is something that helps us kind of couple together calculated similar parameters for a test method that will produce the exact same result. So let's go here and say public, has to be public, static theory data. And in this theory data, I'm going and saying dependency validation exceptions. If you are building an orchestration service, you're going to start saying something like country dependency validation exceptions. You're going to be handling from different places. Okay, let's start with an inner exception, just a simple inner exception. So this is your inner exception equal new exception. Has to be this kind of exception, otherwise it won't take it. Maybe we need a message in there. So this is some message in there. Actually, we need a message. So let's say string random message get random string. Do you have random string? You don't have random
No,
string?
no, we don't have it.
Okay, my friend, no problem. So private I think I know how to do it. I think we'll see. Static string get random string. Look at this guy. And then new mnemonic string dot get value. Okay. Since this string, this message is going to be multiple words, right? Try to be as specific as possible. I'm going to put word count here and say get count. Get random number. How about that? Right? So now I'm getting an actual message. Okay. So here's get random message, a random string, and then in here, inner exception message. Let's just say exception message. And that's your random message right here. Okay, now let's pass this guy in there. So this is exception message. Okay, now I can return here and say new theory data of type exception. Let's make it exception like this, of type exception. And this guy is going to return two things for me. First, new country validation exception. That's coming from your foundation service layer, right? Stop me at any time if I'm not making any sense. It's really important. That's one. And then the second one is country dependency validation exception. Also takes the inner exception. Any questions here so far? So I basically created a method that will provide me with the exceptions that I need to handle and react to the same way.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's the equivalent of you saying inline. Exactly exception if you saying inline. Okay. Now let's create a new file in here. We don't have exceptions yet. So let's go here and copy this file here at the bottom. Let me zoom in for people because we're zooming out and we're getting really serious in here. So okay, here's this guy, and then let me take a copy out. There is exceptions for upsert. Okay, what do I want to do with this exceptions for upsert? I want to go here and collapse all of this nonsense. I'm going to start a new one from scratch. I'm going to go here and say theory, right? And then I want to go here and say member data, right? This is member data, and then name of dependency validation exceptions. Okay, so public async task should throw
Validation.
dependency validation. Nope, dependency validation because you didn't validate anything, right? You're getting it from someone else. Exception, right? On upsert if dependency validation error occurs and log it async. And we are at 123 characters. So let's lose the exception. Now much better. Okay, here's our test. Let's go here and do given when then here's your guy. And then all I want to do here is that your inserted student is just some random student. So I'm gonna go and say sorry, some country, right? So I'm gonna create some random country because I don't care. The exception is gonna happen anyway, regardless of the value of that country, right? Did I lose you or are you still with me? Wake up. Huh? Where is he?
I'm
Where's
with
that
you.
guy?
I'm
Okay,
here.
there he is. Okay, all right. So okay, so now let's fake that exception. What's my expected exception? So var country, processing dependency validation exception. We don't have that exception yet, right? Country
Right. We
processing
don't.
dependency validation exception. And that guy takes in what? It takes in that input parameter that we created. So each one of those is going to give us two input parameters. So here's exception, and this is dependency validation exception. So that's what's coming from that method that we have up there on the theory level. Okay, now I can pass this guy here as an inner. Now watch this. Dot inner exception. This is the unwrapping as exception. Why did I do that, Mehdi? Because I want to maintain the original issue. Now I'm in an unwrapping and wrapping. I'm taking away the original categorization and I'm adding in my own. So something else upstream will be able to deal with it on a larger scale. There's a lot of, I could talk about that for hours because it has its own kind of mindset, but that's a story for another day. Feel free for people watching us, drop a comment there if you really don't understand because that part is really, 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 really important. Okay, so let me steal that country validation exceptions that you have and let me just turn it into dependency validation. Dependency validation. So here's that guy. And then let me go down here and change that. Oops, hold on. Oh man, hold on. Fine. Okay, dependency validation and also in here dependency validation. Okay. We still say country validation error occurred. You shouldn't expose the inner architecture of your system, right? This is a new thing that I just started doing, right? I used to say country processing validation error occurred, right? In here, we're going to say country dependency validation error occurred. Please try again. That's it. That's all you're saying. Okay, perfect. So the system needs to operate as if it's one layer, right? And that's all you need to do. And we say dependency only for the purpose of going and saying, well, you know, there's something downstream that we're trying to communicate with that we can actually get through to it. And that's all. Okay, my friend, let's go back to our test. So now we have our test. Now let's just fake injury. Let's make the exception happen, right? So this is setup. Here's my service. What's the first thing that we call? We call the retrieve all, right?
Yes.
Retrieve all countries, right? So it's retrieve all countries, and this guy is gonna throw what the dependency validation exception, which is this guy. Perfect. Let's go here and create a value task. It returns a country. Upsert country task like this, and then this dot service dot upsert country is sync some country. This guy is good, and then I can go down here and say await assert throws async, and this guy here will take the um, the upsert country task as task, right? And then I can go here and say, here's my mocked component, verify that my service, right? Service dot retrieval,
Times
retrie
one.
retrieval countries happened one time, like this. I also want my logging broker. I want to verify that my logging broker has been called once with that same exception, right? I hope we have the, well, we did the validation, so we're definitely going to have it. So broker.log error, it is like
Same.
this.
Yeah.
Same exception as, right? Did I not call it expected? Expected country processing dependency validation exception. And this guy is called once. And then what? Now we want to go and say the happy path never happened for either one of these cases.
No
Yes?
add, no modify.
Yeah, we want to say there was no add and no modify, right? So this service dot verify, oh, mock verify service, service dot add country. It is any country, doesn't really matter, you know. So you're covering certain places. That's never. And something very similar to that guy here that we're going to put here, which is for the modify, right? Let's modify country. What's the last thing we need to do? We want to go and say verify no other calls. Nobody's doing any funny business behind the scenes. So this is verify no other calls, done and done. So here's a test for you. There's a successful test, I think. It's going to fail, but it's a successful test. Okay, so here's your country processing service. Let's go ahead and run this guy. It's going to produce on the screen two tests. Let me zoom in here for just for people to see that. If you look on the right side here in the test explorer, you're going to see two failing tests instead of one.
Yeah, because of the data.
Yeah. Yeah, wait, it's not even expanding. I don't know. It's probably a configuration or something. But if you look inside the error, do you see this is number one? And it's telling you what exception it passed in. And then here's another one. Do you see? There's two failing tests in here. Back in the ye olden days, and that's just like less than a year ago, less than a few months ago, the Visual Studio 2019 used to actually break them. They're expandable, but now they're not. So boohoo, that's life. What are you gonna do? Now it's time for you to make this happen, my friend. Do you wanna take the screen, make the world
Sure.
rain?
Okay.
All right. I just sent you the code over that white fire grid people call the internet. Let's take a look.
Okay.
All
Let
right,
me
let's go.
let me get your code.
How crazy is that? We're thousands of miles away, completely two different continents, time zones. We're pairing as if we're just sitting next to each other, just writing some code. How great is that?
Oh,
Okay,
and it's happened like 20 years in 20 years or
in 20 years.
20 years.
20 years of what?
I
You
mean,
ta- huh.
this revolution.
Oh, this revolution? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you start somewhere. You gotta start somewhere, right?
All right. Let me run my test. Okay, now I have a question.
Mm.
In the theory data, we passed there two exception.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm thinking in the try catch, I have to write two more
Two
catch,
catches. Two
two
catches.
catches,
But
and
both of
then
them end up with the same result, right? Yeah. Go for it.
okay,
Let's do it. Here we go.
okay, two failure.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Then let's go to, let me collapse this. Go to our processing service country and in the exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
Open it. Now it's a test. This one. Okay. Uh, what we let me Okay. We pass here two things. One, country validation and country dependency
Mm-hmm.
validation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then I will say patch
Yep.
country
Mm-hmm.
validation,
Exception. That's right. Mhm.
not processing, brother, not
Not the
wait.
processing. Yep. Just country validation exception. Yep.
Okay. Now let's go and create a method for that. Throw, create, and log. And it will be dependency, like I create
Yeah.
and
Create
log.
create create and log dependency validation exception, right? Because the validation exception happened from downstream service as a dependency, right?
Exception. All right. And it will get the country validation exception. Okay. Generate a method for me. And it will get
Mhm.
country processing dependency validation exception, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Country processing dependency validation exception. Hmm.
Should I call it specific name or just exception?
Just exception. Hmm.
Okay, and then we will get this exception. And then we say this dot logging broker dot log error country processing dependency, and then we will return this guy.
Okay.
Okay, I think now it should be all right.
Let's see. Go back to your method real quick. So create and log dependency validation exception.
And the other thing we have to pass is
No, 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 no. Hold on. Go back to the method that you wrote. Yeah,
there you go.
that test is gonna fail. Run it and
Yes,
see.
yes, it will fail because we didn't handle this one.
No, not even if you handle the other one. Go ahead and try and see, and then we'll find out why.
All right,
Mm.
not here.
Yeah. So this guy technically is supposed to say one passed and one failed, right?
Yes.
Nope. It'll tell you both of them failed. Mm.
Okay.
So how come? Why is that?
Okay, this one is a uh,
Mm.
exception error, but this one is say logging broker has a problem.
Yeah. Let's take a look at the test again. What's the test expecting us to do? See, a 50% of the solution is to understand what the test wants you to do, right? What's different that this test is asking for that your implementation couldn't satisfy,
Hmm. Country processing dependency validation.
right?
Okay,
And then what?
we create. Ah, I remember, but
Mm.
we did not localize it,
You
right?
didn't really, no, you didn't unwrap.
Uh-huh. But how I say like
Nope, you don't need that because the models that you're working with are already localized.
right, right.
So what's missing in the test and the implementation? Do control. Do, mhm, mhm.
That's inner.
Yeah, that would work. Or you could just add inner exception in the test in the method itself in the country processing dependent validation exception because that's the
Here.
yeah, you could do it right here. Yep. hmm Now why is this guy complaining? Because the inner exception. Yeah, there you go. I'll put that in a new line. Yep. There you go. Now run the test again. You're gonna have a passing. This is the unwrapping piece. That's you unwrapping the categorization from your downstream service that you know is localized. There you go. Now it's gonna say 1 out of 2. Boom.
Right.
Right? Let's do the same thing for the other one then.
Okay. Country dependency exception. The country dependency validation exception. This guy.
That's right. There you go.
Okay. Save it and let's run all.
Uh-huh. Done. Right?
Done.
Okay. So do the commit and all that, but in general, what I was really trying to convey here is that as you can see, right, we did an unwrapping. We took away the categorization out of the downstream service and we added our own category, but we kept the localization. Why did we keep the localized exception though? What's the purpose of that? Do you know?
Because they are for the different service
Huh. Yeah,
and
because that's the actual issue that happened. The categorization helps us treat a whole bunch of exceptions with one way. Like for instance, if you went and said, I'm going to treat every dependency validation exception and every validation exception is a 400 bad request, that would be legitimate, right? But you can also dive deeper into the localized versions of these exceptions and go and say, no, I want to go a little bit further and say, if it's already exists student exception, handle it as 409 conflict. If it's a locked exception, handle it as 423. All these kind of different localizations. So we keep the localization because that's where the value is, and we put a new category on top that basically says something has occurred. Please go ahead and try again or take the next action, whatever the case may be.
okay, now the
Mhm.
things remain is a service.
Yeah. So should we do the same thing by unwrapping and wrapping dependency and service exceptions?
That's why I was a little bit confused because okay, this dependency that here we pro these are the main categories, but the
Mm-hmm.
service is something that uh it's cover everything, and I think it
Yeah.
should be there, but
Yeah. The service is
without
what's
wrapping
left.
stuff.
The service is what's left after we have considered all the options, right? So that's the catch-all. Memory leakage, we couldn't start the service, something crappy happened in the infrastructure, something that there is no way for you to be aware of, and that's defensive programming. Okay, we got that part. We understand that. But there's also the other part, where what about a dependency exception? Like let's say your foundation service is throwing a SQL exception, that's critical dependency exception. So it's going and saying country dependency exception occurred. Should we take the failed storage exception here in that case and add it? Like, do we unwrap from the foundation categorization and add in our processing categorization? Should we do that?
No, no,
Why?
there is no point.
There's no point.
No, because we already did it,
Eh,
and I think here we just want to like we will have a union of exceptions,
right.
and we just say okay,
Eh,
dependency,
mm,
go and through that guy
right.
because it already dependency knows if that SQL exception happens,
Uh-huh.
what to show us, I think.
Right. But what if the server or the dependency threw an exception that you want to communicate differently? Let me give you an example. Out of a service exception or a dependency exception, you can respond with many different things. Let me share my screen here with you and just show you what I'm talking about. So out of my out of a service exception or a dependency exception, you may say there's internal server error. You may say not implemented, rightfully so. So you have two teams working with each other, and they have already shared the Swagger contract. And the other team already finished the implementation while this team is not done yet. They exposed the endpoint, but they're not done with the implementation yet, right? If we don't allow the inner exceptions, the localized exceptions to propagate, how are we possibly going to be able to produce a more meaningful exception? Like variant also negotiates HTTP version not supported, insufficient storage. This one is really, really important. Like SQL Server, look at this SQL Server, insufficient storage error. This is a real thing that happens, and your SQL Server will say insufficient memory. I can't execute. Something happened, right? So this is really, really sophisticated stuff. Of course, that fits in more in the realms where you're not building on top of cloud infrastructure, elastic infrastructure that expands and scales. And your original answer is not wrong either. I used to believe the same thing. I used to say, okay, every dependency and service exception out there that's coming from downstream, all of these exceptions, just treat them the same. Until I realized, actually, no, we need to continue the wrapping and unwrapping all the way up to the controller. And we need to make that a habit, even if we don't have immediate intent in specifying a special error per controller. This is another shift. See, the standard evolves. Like what you just answered is 100% correct. And if you look at any code that I have out there, it will do exactly what you just said. It will go out there and say, if it's a downstream service or dependency exception, just wrap it in a dependency exception and don't worry about the unwrapping. I changed my mind on that. See, that's why I tell people this is I this is why we tell people, it just hit me up until 2 days ago. I was documenting the orchestration service, and I was talking about, handling dependency validation exceptions and validation exceptions downstream services. And then I left one line in there, one single line in there that says, but when it comes to service and dependency exceptions from downstream services, we don't do the same. And then I stopped like this. And I stopped for like almost, I don't know how long, was it 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe half an hour. And then I thought to myself, why? Moving onwards, we should probably handle, we should probably unwrap and wrap, right? Unwrap and wrap as we go upstream. And that's not a big change. It's exactly what you're doing. Like that very same test that we did right now, exactly the same, except that you're gonna do the exact same test, except that instead of you turning it into a dependency validation exception, you're gonna turn it into a dependency exception. Does that make sense? Yes? Good?
Kinda.
All right. So the rest of this is already out there. Like everything else that you're doing is already out there. Handling the dependency foundation exceptions, handling the service exceptions. You can wrap up the rest of this and the content is already out there. And once you're done with this, we need another processing service on the external country service level. Do exactly the same thing. And when you're done with that, I'm going to pull you into another session like this so we can talk about orchestration services. And that's when things get a little interesting.
Okay, now I did not get in something.
Mm.
Now I have to wrap all the exception that we have before in the like a theory data and then create
Well,
one
well, you're gonna,
test.
yeah, well, you're gonna do, that test that failed and passed just right now, the
Yeah.
test that you and I wrote, you're gonna make one exactly like it. Instead, of your theory data having validation and dependency validation, it will have dependency and service exception. That's coming from your
Four,
country foundation
four,
service.
four category goes there.
No, no. You know how in our code here, let me try this again. So if I go here and say, here, you see that test that we just wrote in here? And we said
Right.
that's dependency validation should throw dependency validation exception on upsert. You're going to write a test just like it that says should throw dependency exception on upsert. And instead of having this method here, you're going to create a new one that has two different other exceptions, which are dependency exceptions and service exception.
All right. I got it.
Comprende, amigo?
Yeah, I wake up now.
Okay. All right. All right. Welcome home. Welcome home. We're glad to
Mm,
have you. All right. Cool.
And
It
then the thing is remaining. I
is the
create
service exception.
one processing service for the external, but
No, no, no. Wait, wait. After that test that you wrote, you need one last test to handle the generic exception. Say this is country service, country processing service exception. And that's the one that you need to localize because it's going to come down as a native or external exception, right? It's going to be native exception, which is
okay. But the problem is how we write the processing service for the external, because external is just one method, get all. That's it.
that's it. Then make a pass through. You know, you're just making a pass through. You're writing another retrieve all on the processing service so you balance your architecture. Because you can't have your orchestration service talking to a foundation and then talking to a processing. That's clunky. It's not balanced.
Huh, I remember you said, okay, maybe we don't need it, but we just handle the
You have to
balance.
balance something that I call Florence pattern. This is how you balance your architecture, right? And you know, there will be a point in time where you're going to need it, but for now, you can't just have a spaghetti talk to foundation and processing, whatever comes down, because your architecture will look a little unbalanced there, which is a conversation that we can have when we start talking about orchestration services. Does that make sense?
Right.
All right. And for people watching us, you know, this is we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Mahdi. Thank you
You're
everyone
welcome.
for following us. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please free free drop a comment in the comment section. This video is like the other videos are gonna go right under, you know, the standard repository, you know, where people can just learn about these processing services. And hopefully, you know, we get to see you in another session where we talk about orchestration services. Is there anything
Thank you
else
so
from your
much.
side?
Thank you. Don't follow. Don't follow.
Don't follow. Okay.
But like and subscribe.
All right. Tell me how you really feel. All right. Thank you guys. You take care. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye. Bye.